The webinar will be recorded. And we also recommend that you visit our BIE webpage if you are by a computer. And the web link is in the chat box, www.bie.edu/JOM. The web page contains additional materials that we will be referring to throughout the webinar. Also, one final note, if you could please allow BIE to complete the entire presentation and hold your questions, we would appreciate that. And then once we get to the end, we will prompt you when it is time to begin the comment phase of the webinar, as well as any questions that you have. So with that, we will get started. My name is Maureen Lesky. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico with the Bureau of Indian Education. I am the program manager for the Office of Sovereignty in Indian Education. And I would like for my colleague, Miss Angela Barnett, to introduce herself.
Good morning. This is Angela Barnett. I'm the program specialist for JOM. My office is located at the Oklahoma Area Education Office in Oklahoma City.
Thank you. And then I would also like to turn the mic over to Mr. Clint Bowers, who will provide a welcome message.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar and consultation today. I'm Clint Bowers, Chief of Staff for the Bureau of Indian Education. Just wanted to welcome everyone to provide their comments for improving the John Snow O'Malley program under the Modernization Act that passed late last year. On behalf of the department, the Assistant Secretary, Tara Sweeney, as well as Director Dearman, please utilize this opportunity to provide sound and honest feedback that you really think will make improvements to the program. You know, whether it's looking at the funding formula, the eligibility criteria, as well as our work for putting out the reports and plans to meet the deadlines provided by Congress. Please let us know your thoughts and what we need to do on our end to really ensure that we are providing the best services possible to our schools, to our students in public schools who receive these dollars, these important supplemental education dollars. So we welcome your feedback. Know that we won't put your comments just into a black hole. We will utilize your comments and put them into a consultation report to make sure there's transparency on our end in terms of showing how those comments were either utilized to strengthen the program as it moves forward, or if it wasn't germane, why it wasn't included. But know that we're going to provide honest feedback to you to show you how your consultation comments were included into the record and utilized to enhance the program that serves so many students in public schools. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your questions and comments during this consultation, as well as those comments provided into the record. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you. We'll get started by reviewing the agenda for today. We just went through the welcome. We were discussing the John Snow O'Malley Authority. We will also discuss the John Snow O'Malley Modernization Act and what the Act requires Interior to do. One of the topics, the first topic for consultation will be looking at the definition of eligible Indian student. The second topic for consultation will be looking at the funding formula. The third topic for consultation is looking at the proposed rule, and they're listed as other reconciliation and modernization. Then we will also provide additional information related to John Snow O'Malley in this work, And then lastly, we will be asking for your comments and feedback. And we will also provide email addresses and places to go to on the internet where you can also submit written comments. And we'll start by looking at the Johnson O'Malley Program Authority. This is, I'm sure, very familiar to all of you. We will just briefly review some important dates concerning the Johnson O'Malley program. In 1934, Congress passed the Johnson O'Malley Act, and the purpose for the funding was to provide for the educational needs of Indian students. The Act authorizes Interior to enter into contracts with states, schools, private non-sectarian organizations, tribes, and tribal organizations. And this act is codified at 25 U.S.C. 5342 through 5348. In 1955, BIA established regulations, and in 1975, BIA updated the regulations to what is now in effect, and that is found at 25 CFR Part 273. And then lately, as you all are aware of, in late 2018, Congress updated the Johnson O'Malley Act to the Johnson O'Malley Supplemental Indian Education Program Modernization Act, which we refer to as the Modernization Act for short, which also became Public Law 115-404. And now, at this time in 2019, the next step is to propose changes to the 25 CFR Part 273 to implement the new Modernization Act. So as you can see, the regulations have not been updated since 1975. Moving on to the Modernization Act. In the on the BIE webpage, if you didn't hear me earlier, there's additional materials we will refer to. So if you'd like to see the entire JOM Modernization Act, you can go to the website, bie.edu/JOM, and then you can click on the link to view the entire Modernization Act. The Modernization Act required Interior to do several things. One of those first tasks for Interior is to make an initial determination of the number of eligible Indian students served or potentially served by each eligible entity. This research has been going on for a few months now. The information is also on the BIE web page if you want to take a look at that. It's a separate topic from this consultation, but all of the materials are there, including the data sources that BIE looked at. We will be issuing a preliminary report, which is what the Modernization Act requires, on the number of eligible students served or potentially served. And then there will be a period once the preliminary report is published, that will also be on the website, the BIE website, and then finally there will be a final report which is due at the end of December of this year. The Act also states that after this first implementation year, that in subsequent years, contracting parties will be required to report the number of students that they serve through the Johnson O'Malley program. And then the Modernization Act also identifies an annual report that must be prepared, and that annual report will contain information on the number of eligible Indian students served, recommendations on funding levels, and an assessment of the contract. The Modernization Act directs Interior, in addition to these reports, to complete a rule by December 31st. And the rule is to determine how the regulatory definition of eligible Indian student may be revised. Also to determine, as necessary, how the funding formula may be clarified and revised. And lastly, to otherwise reconcile and modernize the rules. The entire, the proposed rule is also on the BIE website. If you go to the BIE JOM web page, you can look at materials for this presentation and you'll find the proposed rule. And later on in this webinar, we'll highlight some of the major changes from the proposed rule document. Now we're going to look a little closer at the first topic for consultation, which is the definition of eligible Indian student. And before I go on, I'd just like to remind folks out there, if you have a mute button on your phone, if you could please mute your phone so we don't hear any background noise or conversation. And also, if you have not typed in your name in the chat box, your name and who you represent, please do so. Moving on to the first topic, eligible definition of eligible Indian student. We're going to go through a few proposed definitions and what is currently in place. So in CFR 273.12, it states students must be 1/4 or more degree Indian blood and recognized by the Secretary as being eligible for Bureau services. DOI required a 1/4 or more degree Indian blood in addition to membership in a federally recognized tribe. In 1990, a district court ruling found that the eligibility requirements were too restrictive by having both a 1/4 or more degree Indian blood and membership in a federally recognized tribe. So based on this court decision, in 1991, DOI issued a memorandum stating that a student must meet the following requirements: be at least a member of or at least 1/4 degree Indian blood descendant of a member of an Indian tribe. So if you see in the italicized font, right now in 275.12, it states students must have both criteria, be a 4th degree Indian and be a member of a tribe. And then the court decision found that was too restrictive, so DOI issued a memo that changed the and to the or. And then also the DOI memorandum states that to receive services, students, JOM eligible students must reside on or near an Indian reservation. In 2015, BIE did hold consultation on various options for revising eligibility. In 2018, BIE proposed a rule that would have required membership in a federally recognized tribe, deleting eligibility for those who are not members but have 1/4 or more degree Indian blood. So that did not, that was never finalized, that was proposed, and it was decided that Interior would wait to see what the Johnson O'Malley Modernization Act, what it contained, see if it passed. And then now currently, the current wording of the proposed 273-112 is that a student is eligible for JOM.
However, it doesn't matter. I mean, I can go up there and give them out.
I'm going to repeat that. I did find the mute function on the webinar, so I went ahead and muted everyone for now. So right now, the exact wording of the 273.12, the proposed rule, is that an Indian student is eligible for benefits by a JOM contract if the student is from age 3 years through grade 12, is not enrolled in a bureau or sectarian operated school, and is either at least 1/4 degree Indian blood descendant of a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe or a member of a federally recognized tribe. So that is the current proposed rule definition of eligible Indian student for JOM services. I'm going to unmute everyone so that Ms. Angela Barnett can review the next topic. If you could please mute your phones. We're still hearing someone out there, background noise. All right, Angela?
Okay, thank you, Maureen. The second topic is the funding formula. Within the current rule, the funding formula is the number of eligible Indian students multiplied by 25% of whichever is higher, the state average per pupil cost or the national average per pupil operating cost. However, this is different from what the formula BIE has been using since 1988. Since 1988, BIE has been using a JOM formula that relies on data from the U.S. Department of Education on the state annual cost per pupil and the national annual cost per pupil to determine a weight factor. The weight factor is then used to calculate the funding. Education amendments of 1978 PL 95-561, required the Secretary of Education to develop alternative methods for the distribution of JOM funds, and published such formula in the Federal Register in 1979. However, it took 10 years to complete the process. Asia, Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, ultimately recommended a new formula based upon a 1.3 weight factor to be phased in over 3 years. FY 1989 was phased in at a 1.10, FY 90 phased in at a 1.20, and FY 91 was phased in at 1.30. The Appropriations Act of September 27, 1988, PL 100-446, directed the use of this funding formula recommended by Asia to the Committees on Appropriations in a letter dated June 27, 1988. So if you look at the slide, the slide shows the current rural funding formula, 25% of the weight factor times the number of eligible Indian students. The weight factor is the higher of the state average or the national average per pupil operating cost. So in the example, you see where it says the state average is 11,500 and the national average is 13,000. So I'm going to take the 13,000 times the 0.25 and it equals 3,250. So if there were 500 eligible students, then using the formula, the 3,250 times 500 students equals 1,625,000. Then we go to the next slide. The next slide just kind of talks about what we talked previously in the previous slide, and it talks about the Education Amendments of 1978, and where it required the Secretary of Interior to develop an alternative method for the distribution of JOM funds, and published in the Federal Register in 1979, and then the 10 years later, where the new formula was based upon a 1.3 that was phased in, and the Appropriations Act of September 27, 1988 directed the use of the funding formula recommended by Asia to the Committees on Appropriation in a letter dated June 27, 1988. And then on the next slide, the JOM Modernization Act requires the BIE determine as necessary how the funding formula may be clarified and revised to ensure full participation of contracting parties and provide clarity on the funding process. The BIE proposes to revise the funding formula to reflect the formula used since 1988, which is the 1.3. The revised language would provide clarity on what the source is used to determine the initial calculations, how the calculation is made to determine a weight factor by state, and how the minimum weight factor is to be used should the calculated weight factor for the state fall below the minimum. The funding formula for contractors is to be based on the calculated weight factor and the number of eligible Indian students to be served by the contract. The funding formula to determine the funding to be distributed to each contractor is the weight factor multiplied by the number of eligible Indian students, where the weight factor is the state average cost per pupil count divided by the national average cost per pupil count, or a default weight factor of a 1.3 if the calculation results in less than 1.3. So if you look at the slide is saying that determine as necessary how the funding formula may be clarified and revised. So if you look at the example well, not the example, if you look at this, a proposed funding formula, which has been used since 1988, the weight factor times the number of eligible Indian students. So we have the state over the national. If 1.3 or higher, this is if the weight factor is less than 1.3, then we'd use the 1.3 for weight factor. Again, this is the data is from the U.S. Department of Education. And then the next slide is actually putting in some numbers. So the weight factor times the number of eligible Indian students. So we have the state over the national again. If 1.3 or higher, use that. If the weight factor is less than 1.3, we'll use the 1.3 weight factor. So in this example, it's the state average per pupil operating costs, $11,500, and the national average per pupil operating cost is $13,000. So we have the weight factor equals the $11,500 over the $13,000, and that comes out to be 0.88. So since that 0.88 is less than 1.3, then the 1.3 will be used as a weight factor. If we have 500 eligible students, the funding will be 1.3 times 500 equals 650, and this is what's currently being used. And then the next slide, it's just giving you some examples. If a weight factor was the weight factor is 1.3, and you see that by 400, 500, 600 eligible students, and you can see to the right what those numbers would be as far as the funding. And then you see if it was the weight factor was 1.4, using the same numbers and what those amounts would be. And again, for if the weight factor was 1.5, and you'll see what those numbers would be. Again, this is just an example, so that way you could see what it would be like at these different weight factors. And the next slide is the whole harmless provision. The JOM Modernization Act includes a hold harmless provision that remains in effect for 4 years, which states that any existing contracting party may not receive an amount that is less than the amount that that party received for the fiscal year preceding the date of the enactment of the Act. After expiration of the 4 years, the Act provides that no contractor may receive more than a 10% decrease from the amount received in the prior year. The BIE is not able to recommend a new funding formula without decreasing the funds made available to existing contracting parties. After 4 years, it is possible that existing contractors may receive reduction in funding even beyond the FY 2017 levels. The BIE welcomes comments on this matter for any recommendations on how to revise the funding formula proposed in the rules to support all existing contracting parties receiving funding for JOM programs. For 4 fiscal years following the date of enactment of the JOM.
Angela,
Yeah.
could you pause?
Yeah.
Someone, please turn your phone on mute. See if I can find out. Okay, I'm going to try to mute everyone and then unmute you, Angela. Okay.
Okay.
One moment. All right, Angela.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we're good now. I muted everyone except Angela.
Okay. So going on, for 4 fiscal years following the date of the enactment of the JOM Modernization Act, existing contractors will not receive an amount that is less than the amount received for fiscal year 2017, preceding the date of enactment of the JOM modernization, unless the existing contractor fails to submit a complete annual report, the Secretary has found that the existing contractor has violated the terms of a contract under this part, or the number of eligible students reported in the annual report has decreased below the number of eligible students served by the existing contractor in fiscal year 2017. No existing contractor will receive an amount of funding per eligible student that is less than the amount of funding per eligible Indian student that the existing contractor received for fiscal year 2017. Beginning December 31st, 2022, 4 years after December 31st, 2018, date of enactment of the JOM Modernization Act, no contracting party will receive for a fiscal year more than a 10% decrease in funding per eligible Indian student from the previous year. And that completes my presentation on the funding formula.
Thank you, Angela. The third topic is the proposed rule, other reconciliation in modernization. Again, I will remind you to look at the BIE JOM webpage for a full account of the proposed rule. The slides for this next section will be highlights of the proposed rule. It will not contain every change and revision. So please refer to the proposed rule on the BIE webpage for the entire version. And remember, this has not been updated since 1975. So a lot of the changes that had to be made first was to update the format. We had to change the format to a question and answer format. So if you look at the proposed rule, after each section, there's a question, and then there's the answer. So that's the format of the proposed rule. There were also updates to terminology. There was an entire listing section of new definitions. For example, definitions like academic year, approving official, awarding official, contracting party, scope of work, etc. There were also updates to BIE titles. BIE went through a reorganization a few years ago. A lot of the titles that were mentioned, that are mentioned, no longer exist, and so therefore there needed to be an update of the titles and positions the rule refers to. So looking at a couple of examples there on the slide of specific sections, for example, 273.131 changes a deadline of a specific date, February 1st. Point 132 revises the process of the regional review. Point 134 extends the timeline for approval from 60 days to 90 days of a contract decision. Other new sections. Again, I won't read all of these to you. We'll highlight some, and then for a full listing, please look at the proposed rule. 273.120 to 121 adds the approval of the education plan by BIE. 154 to 155 talks about reports when they are due and consequences of not submitting. .194 talks about the authority of the Indian Education Committee regarding canceling contracts. And then there's also a new section 2.207 to 209 regarding dispute resolution and appeals. So the next slide lists a few guiding questions. They're for you to consider. We're not going to go down this list, but they're here to perhaps recommend some areas that you had some questions about or were thinking about, changes that you could provide to make clarifications on different topics. And then here's the BIE website listed, bie.edu/JOM. That webpage contains this presentation, other supporting documents, the proposed rule, the Modernization Act. Previous webinar information is there as well. Another link that you can go to is www.bia.gov, and then there's the entire listing there of the link. You can click on Johnson O'Malley also for finding more information. Comments are due on the proposed rule. We just highlighted a few of the changes to the proposed rule, but the entire proposed rule again is posted on the website, and comments on any changes, recommendations are due August 26th. Those written comments can be submitted via email to consultation@bia.gov. Also to the web link regulations.gov, search for JOM and submit comments. After the comment period, BIE and Interior will view your comments, as Mr. Bowers pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, review the comments, make changes as appropriate. The final rule will be published in the Federal Register, and then the final rule will not become effective for at least 30 days after publication. And again, as mentioned earlier, the final rule is due December 31st of this year. So at this time, we have concluded our presentation, and I will unmute everyone. So please remember, if you are not asking a question, to mute your line. All right, so you should be able to speak and we can hear you now. So if you have a comment or a question about any of the topics, you may talk now. Any comments or questions or any slides you would like us to review again?
Maureen, this is Clint. I also see comments in the chat box, so maybe you can read those questions and address that while we're on.
Let me look. All right, so we have a question here from MICKJ. How or who will give the contractor the deadlines and requirements needed for reporting? That's a good question. I will start, and then my colleagues feel free to chime in, especially Angela. So a lot of the requirements, reporting requirements, are established as part of the grant and contract process, which I'll let Angela talk to regarding that. BIE also is organizing our JOM office. We have one JOM specialist, Angela Barnett, and we are also organizing our office to provide technical assistance on reporting requirements. But I will also let Angela talk about generally what are the general reporting requirements that all contractors must abide by.
This is Angela. Depending on how your contract is being contracted through, if you're a 638, which is self-determination, or 477, which is workforce development, or OSG, which is the Office of Self-Governance, and then some places have commercial contracting. So whatever your current process right now to submit your reports, continue doing that until otherwise directed. I know with the Office of Self-Governance, they are working with, there are some 477 tribes that are OSG tribes, and so OSG is working with 477 to see where the tribes are going to be submitting their reports. And so those could change, but that will not come from this office. However, in the future, if we decide that reports are going to be submitted directly to BIE, then that will come at a later time. But as for right now, you will continue submitting your reports as you did in the past.
I would also add,
and then one other thing I would say, if you haven't been submitting any reports, then you might get with your contractor who contracts your contract and find out where you need to be submitting your report. Okay, Maureen.
Yes. And if you're not sure who you would submit those to, and you're not sure who to start the conversation with, you can contact Angela, and she can help you research the correct communication path. Also, we're aware that throughout the country, there's different deadlines for submitting, for example, the student count. And so one of the tasks we'll be working on this year is to identify a common reporting deadline for submitting the student counts for the subsequent years. Any other questions or comments? Are there any slides that you would like us to go back to and review?
Hi, this is Walter Gray. I'm the Tribal Administrator with the Giddyville Indian Rancheria in California.
Yes.
I just wanted to let you know that I was unable to join the webinar, so I wasn't able to place my name into the record, but I am on the phone and reviewing the slides with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for announcing that. Can you tell me your name again?
Walter Gray, G-R-A-Y.
And I'm writing this down. And where are you from?
Giddyville, G-U-I-D-I-V-I-L-L-E, Indian Rancheria in California.
Thank you.
And I have many comments, but way too many to go on about here, but we'll submit our comments in writing.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you feel comfortable with, and the same goes for others on the call. If you want to take some time to review the slides and look at the entire proposed rule, you're welcome to submit comments until August 26th. You can submit written comments if you prefer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Riley, and I'm calling from the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. And I'm sorry I don't have access to the PowerPoint slides or the webinar. I was just given the telephone number, but I'm filling in for Justine Antonio.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Gordon Yellowman calling in for the Cheyenne Arapaho Tribes. I'm filling in for Francine Williams, who's out doing field work today, and I don't have access on my computer of the slides because our IT department doesn't allow us to go to certain websites, and so I'm on the phone listening.
All right, thank you so much. And where are you from, Gordon?
We're from Concho, Oklahoma. Cheyenne and Arapaho Tribes.
Okay, thank you for announcing yourself. We also will have an afternoon webinar. We will go over the same consultation presentation at 1 o'clock Mountain Time. And you are welcome to join again. You're welcome to forward the information to other people who you think would be interested in attending. Just to note, there is a different phone number and a different web link for the 1 o'clock session. So make sure you look at the web page to get that information if you plan to call in again at 1. Again, the topics that we reviewed, we looked at the criteria for eligible Indian students. Just to review, The proposed rule is a fourth degree Indian blood of a descendant of a member of an Indian tribe, and I'm sorry, or let me say that again. At least one fourth degree Indian blood descendant of a member of a federally recognized Indian tribe, or a member of a federally recognized tribe. So if you have any comments or questions about that, you can ask us now, or you can submit a written comment if you propose an alternative.
Maureen, are there any new comments in the comment section?
I am reviewing.
I think if not, then we can stay on the line until about 12:05 and see if anybody joins at the top of the hour, because we were scheduled for 2 hours, and if not, then we can adjourn. But we'll keep the line open until then. There's no other questions.
There are a couple of questions in the chat box.
Okay, great.
The first is there a percentage of funding that is distributed to the contractor, or is it the total amount of funding that is determined from the student count? Let me read that again in case you can't see the chat box. Is there a percentage of funding that is distributed to the contractor, or is it the total amount of funding that is determined from the student count? And I will turn to Angela for that.
As far as the answering that question, we would have to get back with you on that. But from what I know of, there is a 14.9 million that is allocated for JOM, and how much of that 14.9 million is actually distributed to the JOM program would have to be looked at and by the budget people. And unfortunately, we don't have the budget people online, I don't think. But if there is, if they want to address this answer, then that would be good. Or else we would, if you would, this is being recorded, and we will definitely check into that for you.
Well, Maureen, I think I can probably chime in if this is regarding the funding formula and funding. So I think a lot of the impetus around modernizing the Johnson O'Malley program is that funding has been frozen since 1995. So Native advocates wanted to get a baseline for a new count that could show an increased need, because they know Native populations have increased, student populations have increased. So, but with the student count frozen, it was hard for them to advocate for increased funding or appropriations. I think the annual appropriation set by Congress in 1995 was around $25 million. Since then, annual appropriations has decreased to around $14 million that Angela mentioned. So regardless of the overall target provided by Congress in terms of funding, it's still distributed based on the funding formula, which I think Angela can talk about, and the steps that are needed based on state allocation and then the 1.3 factor, weight factor. However, this is the opportunity during consultation and during the open record as we move forward to look at ways to improve the funding formula based on your input, as well as the rest of Indian country's input. You know, we're going to take your comments and thoughts for ways that the funding formula could be more fair or better distributed to support the local level, and we'll include those in our report and determine a way forward. I think that's the overall general idea of funding formula and how it's based on the appropriation side.
Thank you. There's also another question. How does this affect compact tribes and our reporting? This I think it's the entire program proposed rule. Maybe the person who asked could clarify. How does this affect compact tribes and our reporting? Can you clarify which part, when you say this, are you referring to the entire proposed rule, or the entire, with the funding formula or the eligibility, or just all of it in general?
I think it's going to be all of it in general. I just talked with our self-governance person, and I know that there's things that we've reported in the past, but not, you know, a full annual report, which I know that's something that's been talked about. And we've reported student counts every year that I believe have been submitted, but that, to my understanding, has not been done in a couple of years either. So we're trying to look at all these changes that will be upcoming and maybe what should have been done up to current time. Because what we're hearing is that because we're a compact tribe, there are things we need to be doing, but not everything.
Angela, can you expound on that?
Yeah, OSG is working with their contractors on trying to get them on board on this new modernization. And again, what they are doing is they are researching their tribes to see how they are reporting their and who they're reporting their annual report to. And so they are currently working with all of them to get that all figured out. And that, the last I had heard, that's probably about maybe 2 months ago. So I'm not sure where they're at on that right now, but I know that they are working forward on this new Modernization Act for all their OSG tribes.
And the BIE, just to add to that, the BIE will also be reaching out to the Office of Self-Governance to collaborate and to communicate on what the consensus is for reporting requirements, and then we will make sure we communicate that to the tribes. Thank you. All of these are very good questions. I'm just checking to see if any more were added to the chat box, or if you have any, feel free to speak up. Any more questions or comments? I'm going to review the last slide in terms of where you can submit comments to. Again, comments on this proposed rule is August 26th. The entire proposed rule is on the BIE JOM website. You can email your comments to consultation@bia.gov. You can also go to www.regulations.gov, search for JOM, and submit comments. We will have another session at 1 o'clock if you're interested in attending that. So, Mr. Bowers, would you like to adjourn the meeting?
Yeah, I think we're a couple minutes past noon, so if people were going to join at the top of the hour, they would have. I want to thank everybody for joining the consultation. As Maureen, Angela mentioned earlier, there will be another opportunity this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. That'll also run for 2 hours, but if there's enough folks, we'll keep the conversation going and addressing comments and feedback. If you'd prefer, then the record is open until August 26th. And so please provide those questions or comments for the record, and we will make sure they are clarified and addressed after the open comment period. We want to thank everyone for their input and their dedication to Native students served by the Bureau of Indian Education, and we look forward to improving the programs that can better support our students in public schools. Thank you so much. We'll consider this consultation adjourned for the time being.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.